Caleb Dorsey had always believed in one principle above all else. Ownership meant sovereignty. If you owned your land, you defended it. Not just physically, but ideologically. That belief wasn't born from slogans or ideology, but from a lifetime spent watching systems grow teeth. Caleb wasn't a survivalist, not in the cliché sense. He didn't bury gold bars or write manifestos. He was a realist, a man who had learned over decades that autonomy wasn't given. It was built, watt by watt, inch by inch, brick by brick. And for the last 14 years, he had been building just that on a wide, sunburnt stretch of highland Arizona where the dirt blew red and dry and the horizon never blinked. His land, registered under the Dorsey Ranch Cooperative, was more than property. It was infrastructure. 2 deep wells supplied the water. 3 wind turbines, modest but consistent, fed battery banks tucked into insulated housing. A solar array he'd upgraded himself during the pandemic ran most daytime loads. And then there were the generators. 2 big diesel rigs set into concrete mounts in a recessed, locked facility. Those weren't backup, they were command. During monsoon season, when lightning made the hills spit fire and surge after surge crippled the county's unreliable grid, Caleb's property remained lit, stable, and powered. His neighbors might fumble with flashlights and microwave dinners in their car engines. Caleb didn't blink. His network fed not only his home but also the storage barn, the cold chain facility for processed meat, and a telemetry station that managed irrigation cycles for the South Paddock. Everything he'd built to last. The problem came, as these things tend to do, with a letter. It was thin, sharply folded, and delivered not by the mailman, who knew better than to drive up Caleb's long, winding dirt road without an invitation, but by a uniformed courier with an unmarked clipboard and a condescending smirk. The envelope was pale blue, embossed, and inside was a formal notice from what called itself the North Plateau Regional Infrastructure Group. The language was just vague enough to seem bureaucratic and just specific enough to sound dangerous. Effective immediately, it said. All non-certified personal energy generation systems were to be decommissioned pending compliance inspection. Attached was a fine schedule and a friendly reminder that failure to comply would result in infrastructure reassessment, which Caleb knew was code for forced utility control. The letter was signed by someone named Director V. Santos, which meant nothing to him, but the bottom of the page had a line that made his fingers tighten around the paper. Your cooperation will ensure continued service stability for the greater community. Caleb read the sentence 3 times. He had never signed up for any greater community. He hadn't subscribed, donated, voted, or volunteered. His land wasn't plumbed into any grid, regional or otherwise. There were no easements, no shared transformers, no buried fiber courtesy of tax rebates. Every watt on his property came from systems he'd purchased, installed, and maintained. And yet, here it was. A letter telling him he was in violation of a network he didn't even belong to. At first, he tried to treat it like a mistake. Bureaucracies screw up. It's what they do. Maybe some GIS error had pulled in his parcel with the neighboring plots, small holdings hooked to the main power line that ran parallel to the county road. He called the listed number on the notice, waited on hold through 2 cycles of piano music and hollow corporate platitudes, and finally spoke to someone named Melissa, who read from a script and referred him to a supervisor who never returned the call. 2 days later, a follow-up notice was posted, this time directly to his perimeter gate. Unauthorized access was now prohibited on the service corridor leading to the eastern ridge, where his backup lines ran to the secondary wind relay. That corridor, the document now claimed, had been annexed into the Public Utility Easement Zone under emergency statute. It was subtle at first, almost too coordinated to notice. One morning, he found the padlock on his generator shed had been replaced. Not cut, replaced with a brand new lock that wasn't his. His dogs had been restless all night, but he'd dismissed it as a bobcat prowling the fence line. Then, 3 solar panels along the southern tier had their junction boxes pulled, wires hanging like entrails. Someone had been on his land. Not kids, not vandals, professionals. He filed a report with the county sheriff, who took the statement but clearly had no interest in chasing ghosts who knew how to bypass motion sensors and leave no tire tracks. Caleb wasn't surprised. The county had been under contract with a renewable transition partner since March. Half the land office was subsidized by groups with 3-letter names and ever-changing logos. By the end of the week, one of his diesel generators kicked off without warning. The logs showed an overvoltage trip, but the internal failsafe that should have prevented it had been manually overridden. Caleb found a burned relay and signs of tampering near the intake housing. The implication was clear. Sabotage. It wasn't subtle anymore. This was a campaign, not a messy power grab, not activists chaining themselves to transformers. This was methodical. He didn't rant. He didn't scream. He didn't call the press or threaten lawsuits. Caleb simply walked into his control room and ran diagnostics on every subsystem. Then he checked physical redundancy, rerouted circuits, and began recording every anomaly with time-stamped logs. The next morning, he called Gina, a local electrician who'd helped him build the secondary solar rig during the lockdown years. She wasn't flashy or political. She was reliable, smart, and had a background in industrial security systems from her years working for commercial agritech firms. He didn't tell her what was happening over the phone. He didn't have to. Gina understood the moment he said, "I need you to check the lines coming off the South Slope array, and bring your EM reader." When she arrived, she was already wearing insulated gloves and a chest harness with diagnostic gear. Gina didn't waste time. She checked voltages, magnetic field interference, and discovered 2 unaccounted line signals piggybacking off the neutral line. Whoever was inside Caleb's system hadn't just tripped breakers. They had embedded active signal redirectors to create feedback loops, likely designed to trigger invisible faults that would discredit his system's safety. It was a move Caleb had only seen once before, years ago, during a brief project helping a friend survey mineral rights across a contentious federal-state boundary. That time, the pressure came from a mining company using political clout. This time, it was something bigger, or quieter. "What the hell is this?" Gina asked, peeling back the insulation near one of the hidden inserts. "This looks like military-grade crap. You've been turned into a test bed." Caleb didn't reply. He just stared at the module. Then he walked inside, opened a metal case he kept in the rear shed, and pulled out the object he'd hoped he'd never need again. It looked like a thick, stubby antenna mounted to a gray aluminum box with reinforced shielding. It wasn't a weapon, not in the conventional sense. It was a pulse generator, one he'd purchased legally years ago as a farm-grade device used to test electromagnetic shielding in drone control systems. Mostly obsolete now. But under the right conditions, with the right alignment, it could disrupt small field systems operating within 50 yards. He didn't say a word as Gina followed him back to the house. She didn't ask questions. Neither of them needed to speculate. Someone had stepped onto his land. Someone had tampered with his systems. And someone believed Caleb Dorsey would be too isolated, too tired, or too small to fight back. They were wrong. The storm came in just after midnight. Fast, brutal, and unexpected. Caleb wasn't one to be caught off guard by weather, but this wasn't normal. The forecast had predicted mild winds and light rain, but what tore across the ridge was a dry thunderburst with blinding flashes and a howling front that snapped tree limbs like matchsticks. The ground trembled as a transformer somewhere nearby exploded with a distant pop, and for a few seconds the whole eastern ridge went black. Caleb was already awake when it hit, sitting in the control room of the main house, watching the monitors flicker under erratic voltage. A power surge had slammed into the western line. He'd built enough redundancy into the system that the short hadn't traveled far, but when he checked the logs, something didn't add up. There was a spike, yes, but it was preceded by a drop. A flatline, actually. A total dead zone for 3 seconds right before the overload. Power didn't behave that way naturally. You didn't get a vacuum like that without intent. By the time dawn broke, the wind had died down, leaving behind a trail of scattered debris and a thin layer of red dust that coated every surface like rust. Caleb stepped outside and scanned the property, noting the bent fencing on the north side, a downed pine leaning against the utility shed, and the solar racks covered in grit. What bothered him wasn't the damage. It was what was missing. No birds. No sound. Even the dogs were strangely quiet, ears twitching but no growls. He went straight to the generator vault. The lock was still intact, but the key mechanism had been forced. Inside, the generator wasn't just shut off. It had been disabled. 3 of the cable connections had been deliberately severed. Not cleanly, but with something crude and jagged, like bolt cutters. The control board had scorch marks near the relay housing. A sabotage job, no doubt, and not the work of someone trying to steal power. This was denial. Targeted, deliberate denial. By noon, Caleb had restored the partial power using the auxiliary solar loop, but only to the house. The barn, water systems, and telemetry remained offline. He wasn't panicking yet. He didn't panic, but he was angry. The kind of slow, boiling anger that settled into the back of the throat and burned quiet. He called Gina, told her to bring a diagnostic uplink, and spent the next few hours cataloging damage while rechecking the integrity of every node he could physically reach. When Gina arrived, she didn't speak, just nodded and got to work. She'd seen the marks on the wires and didn't need an explanation. Someone had come during the storm, used it as cover, and tried to blind the ranch. What neither of them expected was the drone. It came just as they were finishing the scan of the water control box, a small quadcopter model humming low over the eastern slope. Caleb spotted it first, pointed without a word. Gina tracked it with a handheld signal tracer, but it emitted no traditional signal. Encrypted, maybe. Silent. It hovered for almost a full minute just above the tree line, then darted off toward the southern service road. No markings. No visible lights. Not a hobbyist toy. Not a child's gadget. Surveillance. That evening, as the air cooled and the dust settled into the cracks of every surface, Caleb returned to the front gate to find another envelope tucked under the latch. This one was heavier, printed on cream paper with raised lettering. Inside, he found what was labeled as a formal notice of compliance violation, issued not by the Regional Infrastructure Group, but by a firm calling itself GridWorks Field Operations. The document claimed Caleb had failed to adhere to Regional Energy Regulation 17.3b, citing unauthorized use of legacy generation systems and unsanctioned infrastructure redundancy. It ordered an immediate cessation of generator operation and stated that further violations would result in administrative restriction of auxiliary utilities, including water access and road ingress. In other words, follow orders or get cut off. At the bottom was a list of enforcement pathways, including a chilling clause about land performance reassessment. Gina read it twice and let out a long breath. "They're not coming after your generator," she said quietly. "They're coming after your land." That night, Caleb sat at his kitchen table surrounded by blueprints, old land agreements, and maps printed on thick stock paper. He wasn't a conspiracy theorist, but he wasn't stupid either. The pattern was emerging, clear as day. The original utility corridor that had once skirted the edge of his land had recently been expanded. Without vote, without hearing. The county had signed off on a partnership with a private utility management entity that had since begun absorbing properties deemed critical energy zones. His parcel, with its independently operating energy hub, fit the definition, especially if, they could discredit its stability. If they could show the system was compromised, unsafe, and reliant on banned equipment, they could take it. Or worse, they could absorb it into their grid and then bill him for the privilege. Caleb contacted his attorney, Marta Keel, based in Tucson, who specialized in land rights and infrastructure disputes. He forwarded the letters, the photos, and Gina's diagnostics. Within a day, she confirmed what he feared. The company behind GridWorks had been involved in 3 lawsuits in the last 2 years, all involving disputed property absorption in rural zones. The outcomes were mixed. In one case, the company had used legal loopholes involving water access to force a property owner into a buyout. In another, they'd manipulated zoning language to reroute utility service lines through disputed easements. And now, it seemed they had turned their attention to Caleb's land. Marta advised him not to engage directly. "Let them act," she said. "We gather, we document. But no confrontation unless they cross a line that affects your legal standing." Caleb agreed, but privately he began preparing. Not with violence, not with some half-baked rebellion. He hardened his systems, physically isolated his comms, added surge arresters, and rerouted some wiring to make external tampering more difficult. It wouldn't stop a professional operation, but it would slow them. It would make them reveal more. 2 days later, the water stopped. Without notice, without a visit. The well pump had power, the wiring was intact, but no water flowed. He followed the piping down to the control valve and found it had been turned remotely through the telemetry interface, an interface he had physically disconnected 2 years earlier. Someone had reinstated it. That was the breaking point. Not the storm, not the drone, not the letter, but the water. That was life. That was non-negotiable. He called Gina again. She arrived within the hour, along with a box she pulled from the back of her truck. Inside was a hand-built electromagnetic pulse tester she'd originally designed for assessing equipment hardening at commercial farms. It had a limited range, but enough force to disrupt most unsecured field equipment. "I brought it because I figured you'd say yes," she said before he could ask. "You said they crossed a line. I agree." Caleb looked at the device, then at the ridge where the drone had hovered, then at the part of the slope where the utility line crossed into what had once been neutral land, but now housed the access node for the region's temporary relay system. It was shielded, sure, but not completely. Not from a smartly timed pulse during a test window when the system wouldn't be actively monitored. They didn't need to say more. Plans had a way of righting themselves when enough pressure pushed from the outside. They just had to wait. Not long. The utility company had already announced rolling service validations for the region, citing weather stress and load recalibration. They'd given a public notice window, and that was enough. Caleb didn't want war. He didn't want escalation. He wanted distance, but if they were going to force him to the edge, he would meet them there, prepared, quiet, and entirely within his rights. And when he pushed back, it wouldn't be with noise. It would be with silence. Their silence. Their blackout. Their moment of static. And they'd never see it coming. By the end of the week, the pressure had evolved from sabotage and silent threats into something more tangible, more systemic. What began as anonymous interference now took the form of coordinated denial, an invisible cordon closing in around Caleb's land with each passing day. It started subtly enough. The county's website listed his parcel as being under resource reassessment, a term that had no formal legal weight but was enough to delay every request he submitted. A simple application to verify zoning definitions, which he had initiated to prepare for legal reinforcement, was returned marked pending compliance verification, with no time frame given. Then came a visit from a man in a suit. Not the kind who drove up dusty ranch roads every day. His vehicle was clean, dark blue, parked carefully just off the gravel by the gate. No markings but with plates registered to the same regionally contracted utility group. He didn't knock or call. He simply waited, hands behind his back, posture like he'd rehearsed it in a mirror. Caleb watched from a distance before finally approaching, slowly and deliberately. The man introduced himself as Thomas Delroy, a compliance liaison, though he offered no badge, no card, and no paper trail of any kind. He spoke with the polite detachment of someone reading a warning from a laminated script. He explained that the property was currently in breach of transitional infrastructure policy, and that regional oversight had reasonable cause to pursue administrative arbitration. Caleb listened, said nothing, and only asked once whether Thomas had a warrant. When the man offered a non-answer and gestured vaguely toward his tablet, Caleb stepped back and told him to leave the property. Thomas didn't argue. He merely nodded, turned, and left. But the next day, another envelope arrived. This one bore an official county stamp and included a temporary restriction order on infrastructure alterations. Caleb was no longer allowed to modify his own energy systems. Not the wiring, not the enclosures, not even the grounding rods, until a scheduled inspection by the Regional Energy Authority, an entity that had appeared just 2 weeks prior and whose contact number redirected to the same voicemail loop he had already encountered. The entire region, it seemed, was being slowly woven into a private network masquerading as a public policy. Rural properties were reclassified into energy stabilization zones, allowing control to pass from local municipalities to a hybrid consortium of contractors and regulators with no accountability to the landowners they affected. Caleb's lawyer confirmed it. The statute was recent, passed quietly under an omnibus legislative package after the previous wildfire season, when panic had opened the door for sweeping emergency measures. Public safety was the wedge, and energy was the lever. Within days, Caleb began experiencing supply issues. Deliveries that had always arrived on time, fuel, feed, fencing supplies, were delayed indefinitely or rerouted. The vendors, apologetic but helpless, blamed new routing policies and distribution protocols that required prior clearance through a regional logistics gateway. Some of them privately admitted they'd been pressured to drop Caleb as a client altogether. His name had shown up on a list. One even called it a flagged site. No one would say more than that. He didn't blame them. He knew what it meant to be squeezed by pressure from above. They had businesses to run, families to feed. Even his bank called. A middle manager offered a concerned tone as they informed him that his credit accounts were being subjected to an audit triggered by inconsistencies in power usage reporting. The language was absurd. Caleb didn't report power usage to anyone. His system was independent. But somehow financial flags had been placed on his accounts, suggesting that someone had convinced the financial institutions he was misreporting income or misclassifying commercial utilities. Caleb didn't shout. He didn't storm into offices. He did what he always did: documented, recorded, and adapted. He scaled back usage on non-essential circuits, relocated sensitive electronics to hardened units, and replaced the generator relay core with a manually operated bypass, one that couldn't be shut down remotely. He also initiated a quiet conversation with two of his older neighbors, men who had watched the region transform over decades. One of them, a retired agronomist named Vince, confirmed the pattern. 3 properties in the last year had gone silent. Owners pushed out, pressured into selling, sometimes through legal channels, sometimes through what could only be described as economic starvation. What made Caleb's case different was his refusal to yield. Most people complied when the pressure became personal, when it touched their water, their money, their families. But Caleb didn't have a family, and he didn't need their money. Still, the tension climbed. One night, Caleb returned from inspecting the northwest fence to find that the lock on the primary water vault had been drilled. Not picked, not broken, drilled. A precise, cylindrical bore straight through the center. Inside, the pressure gauge had been turned to its maximum setting, just below the failure point. If he hadn't noticed, the line could have ruptured, flooding half the property and destroying the irrigation controller. He repaired it manually and installed a separate mechanical valve that bypassed digital control altogether. Gina, after hearing what had happened, brought him a field-grade signal analyzer. Industrial, not commercial. Together, they walked the perimeter, sweeping for unknown frequencies. It didn't take long to find them. 2 separate high-frequency pulses, not strong enough to carry voice but consistent and narrow band, bouncing between the nearest power pole and a nondescript black unit bolted halfway up the slope. They followed the signal source to an inconspicuous enclosure, which Caleb knew had once been a passive booster for old phone lines. Now it was active. Newly installed, professionally weatherproofed, and locked tight. "This isn't local," Gina muttered, crouched beside the unit. "This is federal grade. They're using distributed infrastructure to penetrate private systems." Caleb didn't reply. He didn't need to. That night, he opened a rusted box inside his shed and removed a small notebook wrapped in plastic. It contained hand-drawn schematics, fail-safes, old designs for EMP field testers he'd worked on years ago during a consulting contract that had been buried under non-disclosure and classified procurement. He wasn't going to launch anything, not yet, but he wanted to remember how the shielding patterns worked. He wanted to remember where to aim, what to avoid, how to knock out systems surgically without blowing open a war. 3 days later, the final act of aggression came. His driveway, his own private road, surveyed, fenced, and legally defined, was blocked by a flatbed truck parked across the entry. No logos, no plates, just a shadow sitting in plain sight. Caleb approached on foot, carrying nothing but a flashlight and a voice recorder in his pocket. A man stepped down from the cab, dressed in worker's overalls, face unremarkable, posture casual. "Got some line work happening further down," the man said. "Temporary staging." "You're on my land," Caleb said. "Didn't see a sign," the man replied. "You passed 4, Caleb answered, pointing to the gate. The man looked amused. "Look, I'm just here doing a job. No harm, no foul. Move it. Not my call, boss. Dispatcher tells me where to sit." "You want it gone? Take it up with them." That night, Caleb installed motion-activated strobes on both sides of the gate and a high-frequency noise generator tuned to disrupt unshielded drone optics. He wasn't bluffing anymore, and he wasn't waiting. If they came back, if they pushed again, the EMP rig would not stay on the shelf. It would be deployed, tested, and aimed, directed not at homes, not at civilians, but at the relay that had been illegally wired into his system, the one they thought he hadn't noticed, the one they assumed was invisible. And when the pulse hit, when their relay station went dark, when their systems chirped and crashed and failed, he wouldn't gloat. He'd just record the moment, timestamp it, log it, and wait for them to make their next move. Because it was coming. And he would be ready. The first real break in the fog came not from a dramatic confrontation or late-night sabotage, but from a worn manila folder, half-wrinkled, that Gina found behind a false panel inside the rusted signal enclosure they had previously identified as the pulse repeater. They hadn't planned on opening the unit. Caleb had specifically advised against tampering with anything that could be traced back to them, but a sudden rainstorm had flooded the lower slope and washed enough mud down to expose a poorly concealed maintenance hatch. It was half open, and curiosity outweighed caution. Gina, ever methodical, approached it with gloves and minimal contact, pulling the hatch open just enough to reach inside. There was nothing electronic inside the chamber, which was unusual, just a tangle of old wires, a discarded coaxial adapter, and the folder. It had no markings beyond a smudged barcode, and the paper inside smelled of oil and copper. What was curious wasn't the documents themselves. It was what they proved through omission. There were site maintenance logs dating back 6 months, signed by contractors Caleb had never heard of, and routing diagrams that traced power lines and data relays that, according to every public utility map, didn't exist. It wasn't confirmation of wrongdoing, it was something more damning, evidence that this entire system operated in a shadow zone just outside regulation, engineered to fall between the cracks of state oversight. Caleb didn't celebrate the discovery. He didn't even speak for nearly an hour. He sat with the folder on his lap inside the control shed, flipping through each page, memorizing signatures and timestamps, correlating the lines drawn on technical diagrams with the real-world installations he'd seen over the past few weeks. Gina watched silently, understanding without words that something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just about him anymore. The implications stretched far wider than a ranch, wider than property lines or zoning definitions. This was a pilot program, an experiment in how to quietly absorb rural infrastructure into a corporate-regulated network under the guise of disaster management. What made Caleb's land so crucial wasn't its location or its independence. It was that it had everything they needed to model and replicate the system elsewhere. His autonomous energy grid was fully operational, tested under extreme conditions, scalable, and proven. They didn't want to destroy it. They wanted to own it. That night, Caleb scanned the entire folder and sent it to Marta, his attorney, along with his latest set of surveillance footage, telemetry data, and a handwritten statement outlining what had been happening since the storm. Marta responded within hours, not with a legal brief or official motion, but with one sentence. "Don't talk to anyone without me present." That was enough. Caleb locked down external communications, unplugged non-essential relays, and moved Gina into the spare room at the main house with her gear. Neither of them said it out loud, but both knew things were about to escalate. Quietly, professionally, without warning. The next day, Caleb's contact at the county recorder's office, someone he'd known casually for years, called him with a voice thick with hesitation. She said a request had been submitted to reclassify his property from agricultural special use to strategic energy site. The request was filed by a representative from a development firm he didn't recognize, and it was marked for expedited. Internal review. In normal times, such a change would take months, require public posting, multiple hearings, and direct notification. But under the new emergency infrastructure protocols, the designation could be approved in under a week unless challenged by a certified stakeholder. Caleb, technically, wasn't considered one under the new guidelines because his primary water source was connected to shared resource zones, a classification that had only appeared in policy 2 months prior. He thanked her, hung up, and walked outside. The light was sharp and clear that morning, windless and unusually quiet. It was the kind of morning he once would have called perfect. Now it felt suffocating. Everything was in motion. Every system he'd trusted to keep him separate was being dismantled, line by line. Not through force, but through interpretation. They were changing the language of the rules in real time. And no amount of logic or ownership papers would protect him if they simply rewrote the game mid-play. That afternoon, Gina intercepted a low-bandwidth packet being broadcast intermittently from a utility relay less than 200 yards beyond Caleb's western fence. The packet was encrypted, but its headers contained enough metadata to reveal its origin. A private node labeled Unit A27, Grid Integration Testing. It wasn't just monitoring voltage. It was collecting behavioral data, tracking power fluctuations, mapping response times, cataloging patterns in energy draw and restoration. They were mapping his habits through the very systems they'd corrupted. Every moment Caleb thought he was adapting. They were watching, learning, adjusting their tactics. It was, in its own way, brilliant. But it also gave him what he needed: a confirmed breach of surveillance without disclosure. Gina flagged the headers, isolated the source, and scrubbed a copy of the signal log for Marta. That kind of unlicensed observation, especially on private land, wouldn't hold up in court, not if the defense could show it had been used to justify subsequent actions. The only problem was time. If they succeeded in reclassifying his land before legal resistance was filed, all evidence would be moot. They'd argue that energy data gathered from an emerging grid asset fell under internal analytics. He had days, maybe less. They worked in silence for hours, neither of them resting, fueled by focus and quiet fury. By nightfall, the plan was drawn. They would use the upcoming scheduled validation cycle, a brief period when utility systems were expected to go offline for firmware updates, to initiate a pulse strike. Not broad, not dramatic. A precision discharge directed at the node labeled A27. Gina calibrated the EMP rig for minimal overspill. Caleb mapped its location relative to the other nodes and placed shielding to prevent collateral damage. Their window was just under 6 minutes, long enough to deliver a decisive strike, short enough to avoid detection during a known blackout period. They weren't looking for destruction. They weren't looking to harm. They needed to force the hand. A system like this didn't survive under scrutiny. It depended on quiet compliance. The moment it faltered publicly, the entire apparatus would have to pause. And in that pause, Marta could strike with filings, evidence, and injunctions. The EMP wasn't retaliation. It was a tactical delay. Caleb stood on the ridge that evening, looking out toward the black column of trees where the signal had been traced. He didn't feel like a saboteur. He felt like a man reclaiming the borders that were quietly, surgically being taken from him. This wasn't about power. It wasn't even about his land anymore. It was about refusing to be reshaped into someone else's model of usefulness. He'd spent a lifetime building something that worked. Not perfect, not pretty, but his. Entirely his. And now it was time to send that message. Not in words. In silence. In a blink of interruption. In the moment when their systems blinked, froze, and stopped, if only for seconds, he'd make it known. You don't get to rewrite reality without resistance. The night of the planned pulse came without drama. There was no lightning in the sky, no strange cars parked outside the fence, no buzzing of drones or whispering wind to foreshadow what Caleb and Gina were about to do. Just dry, unmoving air and the faint ticking of the generator's control relay, idling at a quiet heartbeat behind the barn. The ridge beyond the western boundary lay still, almost too still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Caleb had double-checked the targeting rig twice before sunset, and then once more in complete darkness, guided only by dim red light from a filtered headlamp. The device, though compact, wasn't light. It had been mounted inside a reinforced transport case lined with foam and manually calibrated using a custom dial that adjusted pulse duration by millisecond increments. The idea wasn't to fry anything permanently. That would be reckless and legally indefensible. But to interrupt, to shake, to fracture the illusion of invincibility these unauthorized systems carried. They needed a break in the signal chain. Just long enough to create a log entry in the host server, a fault record that couldn't be easily explained away. The target node, Unit A27, had been selected not only for its proximity but because it functioned as a junction, a sort of passive clearinghouse through which multiple telemetry packets flowed before being rerouted to larger collector towers farther. To the west, knocking it offline, even momentarily, would create a cascade of minor diagnostics triggers across the regional network, and while none of those alone would alert federal infrastructure monitors, together they would form a picture that someone, somewhere, would have to explain. That explanation would require pulling logs, which would lead to timestamps, and those timestamps, if Marta moved fast enough, would align perfectly with the evidence of unauthorized surveillance they had already captured. Caleb wasn't a hacker, nor was Gina. They didn't need to be. They just needed to create the first stumble in what had been until now a surgically precise and legally invisible operation. They activated the pulse rig at 1:32 a.m., 7 minutes into the declared blackout window that had been announced through the regional power board as a part of a rolling update cycle. Gina initiated the countdown while Caleb stabilized the device. Against a concrete mount he had repurposed from an old gate post. The coil hummed quietly at first, barely audible, like an old fridge motor warming up. Then it surged. The output light blinked once, and the air felt momentarily heavier, like static pressure before a storm. A sharp snap echoed through the ridge, a clean, metallic click, and then silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from nothing happening, but the kind that follows an event so sudden it robs the world of background noise. They waited 30 seconds. Then Gina shut the system down, disconnected the coils, and packed it away. No sirens came, no calls, nothing. At 2:05 a.m., Caleb checked the voltage readings coming off the southern fence and saw a drop in ambient current. The spike detectors inside the node enclosure had flatlined for 3.5 minutes, which meant the device had worked. Not just a pulse, but an actual relay interruption. Gina confirmed the broadcast frequency from the node had ceased entirely during that period and had only resumed under a different hash pattern, which suggested a forced reboot. They had triggered a fault. The system had blinked, and now, for the first time, Caleb had the verifiable data that the node, illegally operating on the boundary of his property, had undergone a forced reset in direct correlation with their signal. The digital fingerprint was undeniable, but victory didn't come with relief. It came with more pressure. The next morning, a low-altitude helicopter circled the area. Not military, no markings, but heavy, low-bladed, and equipped with imaging gear. Caleb didn't run inside. He stood openly on his deck, arms crossed, eyes following the slow pattern of its flight. It made 3 passes, then disappeared north. 30 minutes later, a ping arrived on his satellite receiver. A formal citation. Not from any court or sheriff, but from the Regional Utilities Assessment Board, accusing him of non-cooperation with grid transition policy. The notice was packaged with a recommendation to suspend all activity classified as independent infrastructure operations, and contained language suggesting he was interfering with stability modeling. What made it dangerous wasn't its accusation. It was its embedded code. The packet had attempted to initiate a handshake with his telemetry system. If Caleb hadn't air-gapped that network, the signal would have executed an authentication override that essentially gave the issuer control. Not just monitoring. Access. Gina pulled the logs. The signal source was masked, but matched the same IP family they'd seen previously. This time, however, it had been routed through a civilian network, an ISP tied to an office complex in Phoenix that, after a few calls from Marta, turned out to house a shell company connected to the same development firm trying to reclassify Caleb's land. The overlap was no longer speculation. It was tactical orchestration. By noon, Caleb's entire fuel delivery for the month had been canceled. The supplier cited contractual risks and offered to refund his advance payment. The same day, his online access to regional land maps, usually public, was revoked. A message on the portal stated his account had been flagged for recredentialing. Even local weather station data, which he used to calibrate irrigation timing, showed a delay in sync. The world around him wasn't collapsing, but it was narrowing, channels closing, options folding in on themselves. Gina proposed they escalate. Not through another pulse, but by going public. Not media, not viral expose, but direct filing. Marta agreed. She had already prepared an injunction request and sent it to a federal circuit judge known for opposing unchecked regulatory sprawl. The affidavit included signal logs, hardware IDs, Gina's field recordings, drone captures, and the node schematic. The judge responded within hours with an emergency stay order, halting all activity on Caleb's land tied to the transition policy. It was temporary, 15 days, but it was something. They had drawn first blood in the legal theater. The stay order had an effect. Not a loud one, but visible in the way things paused. No new letters. No citations. The helicopter didn't return. Delivery schedules stayed canceled, but no further escalation occurred. For 72 hours, the land felt normal. The fence gates remained untouched. The signal readers stayed quiet. Even the power pulses across the southern grid stabilized. But silence, Caleb had learned, was never peace. It was planning. And sure enough, it broke on the fourth day. The EMP rig was stolen. Caleb had hidden it under a false panel in the second barn, shielded by metal feed bins and locked behind a door that had been untouched for years. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken locks, no disturbed ground, no tripped sensors. Just emptiness. The case was gone. The bolts removed cleanly. The mount left unscrewed with surgical precision. Whoever took it didn't break in. They had the time, the tools, and the codes. He knew the implications. The message was clear. They weren't afraid anymore. He called Marta. She filed an immediate theft report but warned him what it really meant. They were ready to shift strategies. The silent pressure was over. Now they'd begin the narrative phase. Make him look unstable, dangerous. A man with unauthorized weapons and a grudge against public safety. By evening, a knock came at the gate. This time, it wasn't a contractor or a courier. It was two men in plain clothes and a woman in a slate-gray blouse with a clipboard. They introduced themselves as representatives of the Infrastructure Compliance Board and requested access to validate safety protocols. Caleb refused. They cited a state oversight clause. He handed them the stay order. The woman frowned, scanned it, and made a quiet call. When she hung up, she said, "You've delayed the inevitable." And Caleb, standing just inside the gate, said calmly, "That's what walls are for." They left, for now, but the game had shifted. The lines had hardened. The silence now was loaded with expectation, and the next move would not come from the ridge or the mail or a softly blinking node hidden behind a tree. It would come from a courtroom, from filings, from exposure. Because the real fight had just begun. The hearing wasn't scheduled in a courtroom, but in a beige administrative building tucked behind a DMV satellite office and an unfinished post office annex. The kind of location intentionally chosen to feel neither public nor important. Caleb arrived early, dressed in clean work jeans and a pressed denim shirt, his boots scraped but oiled. He sat in a chair against a faded wall lined with pamphlets on energy transition programs and cooperative infrastructure grants, all stamped with smiling clip-art homes and tidy lawns. Nothing in the room acknowledged rural landowners like him. No ranches, no turbines, no livestock, just diagrams of solar grids and smart nodes with the promise of effortless control. Gina came with him, silent and focused, a binder tucked under her arm filled with screenshots, voltage readouts, and printouts of scrambled transmission logs she'd painstakingly decoded by hand. Marta arrived last, composed and unreadable, holding a flat leather case that contained the full scope of their complaint, one that stretched across trespass, unauthorized surveillance, malicious interference, and a formal challenge to the legitimacy of the private consortium overseeing the energy realignment in Caleb's region. The panel of adjudicators sat behind a folding table that was somehow both temporary and heavily guarded. 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, all dressed in various shades of compliance gray, not a single badge among them. They didn't introduce themselves beyond first names: Lena, Craig, and Marcus. Their role, they explained, was to facilitate resolution and ensure regional alignment. It wasn't a legal proceeding, they reminded Marta before she could speak. It was a regulatory consultation. Marta nodded coolly and said, "That'll be noted for the record." Caleb didn't speak at all. He watched the panel the way he watched skittish livestock, waiting to see which one twitched first. The hearing began with a summary of the consortium's position. A lawyer Caleb hadn't met, young and clean-shaven with glossy fingers that had never touched soil, read from a scripted defense. He painted Caleb as resistant to integration and uncooperative with critical infrastructure assessment, citing the stay order as a misunderstanding of jurisdictional reach. He argued that Caleb's land, given its position and energy potential, had already been tagged for integration long before the current phase began, and his resistance now represented a threat to regional energy stability. The stolen EMP rig, conveniently, was introduced into the record as evidence of unauthorized electronic disruption, with a subtle implication that Caleb had engaged in hostile interference. The fact that it was gone, stolen under suspicious silence, was never questioned by the panel. Then Marta stood and spoke in a voice that carried the entire room, quiet but sharp. She laid out the timeline, the sabotage, the drone surveillance, the installation of unauthorized data repeaters, the cloaked attempts to access Caleb's telemetry grid, the illegal relay on the southern fence line, and the very clear indications that his land had been targeted not as a safety risk, but as a test bed for unregulated energy mapping. Gina submitted the folder found in the utility box, highlighting the falsified maintenance logs and diagrams of junction nodes tied to private IPs routed through Phoenix. The air in the room shifted. The panel members no longer maintained eye contact. One of them, Craig, began tapping his pen against the table, soft at first, then with a steady rhythm, like a clock measuring the erosion of certainty. When Marta finished, she added one final statement. "We are prepared to submit this entire package to federal oversight if this body fails to recognize that the actions against Mr. Dorsey are not regulatory in nature, but predatory." Silence followed, not out of respect, but out of calculation. Lena cleared her throat and asked, almost bored, "Are you alleging a conspiracy, Ms. Keel?" "No," Marta replied. "I'm alleging a pattern, repeated, documented, and provable. You may call it what you like." That evening, the panel took a recess. Caleb didn't wait in the building. He stepped outside and leaned against the railing near the parking lot, watching a delivery van unload pallets of bottled water next door. For a few minutes, it felt like any other county office day. Then Marcus, the panel member with the quietest voice, joined him outside. He didn't say anything at first, just stood nearby, hands in pockets, eyes on the horizon like they were two old men talking about the weather. "You made them nervous," Marcus said eventually. Caleb didn't respond. "They're not used to pushback. Most of the time, people just fold. Take the buyout, sign the integration papers, move closer to town. They don't know what to do with someone who still fixes his own wiring and knows what a relay fault sounds like." Caleb said, "They should have figured that out before cutting off my water." Marcus gave a dry laugh. "They don't think like that. They think everything is replaceable." Even silence. Caleb turned his head slowly. "Are you telling me to stand down?" "No," Marcus said. "I'm telling you they didn't expect someone who remembered what ownership used to mean." Inside, the hearing resumed. The panel didn't issue a final decision that day. Instead, they deferred judgment, citing additional documentation review and potential jurisdictional overlap. Marta took that as a win. Caleb didn't. He didn't trust silence anymore. Delay, in this case, meant repositioning, strategy shifting. Somewhere, someone was recalibrating the next angle of attack. He was proven right within 48 hours. A contractor working on the Eastern Relay, unaffiliated, or so they claimed, accidentally dug into one of Caleb's private water lines. It flooded a small quadrant of land near the old paddock and wiped out 2 valve control units. When confronted, the crew leader produced a permit, backdated, vaguely worded, and referencing a regional infrastructure trenching operation, approved by a subcommittee Caleb had never heard of. Marta filed a formal cease and desist, but the damage was done. They were escalating under the radar now using outsourced deniability. That night, Gina found a secondary relay unit hidden inside a hollowed section of utility pole, running parallel to the line they disabled with the EMP. It hadn't just replaced the node, it had upgraded it, cloaked deeper with better shielding and signal masking. They weren't backing down, they were doubling down. Caleb made one call. Not to the press, not to the county, to a retired network security expert he'd met years ago while helping install telemetry on a cattle co-op in northern Texas. The man owed him a favor, and within hours Caleb had access to a suite of signal sweepers and a digital forensics kit that didn't exist in public databases. Together with Gina, he mapped every frequency, every pulse, every silent request made to and from his grid. What they uncovered made the previous surveillance look primitive. The entire system had evolved to anticipate resistance. It wasn't just tracking usage, it was modeling behavior, predicting patterns and adjusting broadcast strength based on time-of-day power draw. It was learning from him. They knew the fight had moved beyond physical tampering or bureaucratic games. Now it was cognitive territory, predictive control, behavioral mapping. The only way to stop it wasn't just through courts, it was through exposure. Caleb agreed to one thing he'd long refused. He let Marta contact a quiet federal watchdog group that monitored irregular infrastructure patterns tied to corporate testing. He didn't want fame. He didn't want interviews. He wanted the system to stumble so hard it couldn't recover before being rewritten. If they hit it from inside, legally, digitally, structurally, then maybe it would fall apart under its own design. The final strike wouldn't come with a rig or a relay. It would come with code, affidavits, timing, and exposure. Not fast, not loud, but absolute. Because now it wasn't just Caleb's land on the line. It was the precedent. And no one rewrote that without a fight. The final outcome didn't arrive with fanfare or headlines. There were no press conferences, no public apologies, no viral takedowns. The machine that had been pushing against Caleb's life didn't break with a bang. It folded, quietly, like something slipping underwater. It began with an internal audit leaked anonymously to Marta. The document was dense, bureaucratic, but unmistakably damning. It outlined a pilot model for rural infrastructure integration that included behavioral modeling, non-disclosed surveillance, adaptive signal engagement, and property absorption under emergency reclassification clauses. Caleb's land was listed by name, test node CDOR/AR7, flagged as ideal for stress response simulation due to its independent energy grid and limited regulatory entanglements. The language was cold, mechanical, devoid of ethics. It wasn't a mistake. It was a blueprint. Marta moved fast. She presented the document to a federal mediator through the watchdog group, backed it with Caleb's data, Gina's recordings, and the cross-reference signal logs. That same week, 3 cease and desist orders were issued. 1 to the Regional Development Consortium, 1 to the infrastructure contracting firm operating the node network, and 1 to the oversight panel itself. The effect wasn't immediate, but it was firm. Trucks stopped showing up. Surveillance relays ceased broadcasting. The panel members resigned without statements. The infrastructure reassessment program was suspended pending review. No one said the word illegal, but the silence was its own admission. Caleb didn't celebrate. He wasn't built for victory laps. The damage to his property was still there. The water lines scarred, one of the generators needing full replacement, and months of psychological erosion not easily repaired. But the pressure lifted. Systems he'd locked down remained untouched. His supply routes reopened without explanation. Even the bank quietly reversed its compliance flag. reactivating his accounts with a half-hearted apology about a clerical error. What returned wasn't peace exactly, but control. And that was all he'd ever wanted. Gina left 2 weeks later back to her workshop, promising to stay in contact. She didn't say much about what they'd been through. She didn't need to. They had seen how far the line could be pushed before it fought back. They had watched something larger than both of them try to remake reality, not through force, but through slow erosion. And they had stopped it, not because they were heroes, but because they were stubborn. Stubborn in the way that mattered most, quietly, methodically, without compromise. Marta kept a copy of every document, not for lawsuits, not for legacy, but as proof, for the next time. Because there would be a next time. Somewhere else, another landowner, another boundary quietly redrawn, another system repurposed under the guise of safety. What they had done wasn't about winning a case. It was about drawing a line others could see. As for Caleb, he replaced the broken relay by hand, dug new trench lines with his own tools, reinforced the shed with heavier locks, and switched to fully analog control systems where possible. He didn't go back to the way things were. He adapted, hardened, not out of fear, but out of principle. Not everything could be trusted anymore, but some things still could. Steel, soil, code written by hand, people who showed up when it counted, and at night, when the wind passed cleanly over the ridge and the turbines turned in rhythm, he listened, not for silence, but for interference, for signals that no longer came, for a sky that belonged to itself again.